The signs that Jesus said would announce his return are not stacked in some distant future. They are stacked inside the news cycle of the week you open this video. You did not see them because you stopped looking up, and the church around you stopped pointing. You think the second coming is a topic for end times conferences and discount paperback books with bad covers. You grew up hearing pastors mention the return of Christ in the closing prayer and then change the subject before the offering, and you assumed the signs would all be obvious, supernatural, and unmistakable. Then you actually read Matthew 24, Luke 21, and 2 Timothy 3, and you realize that Jesus and Paul described the days before his return with sentences that read like today's headlines. The wars are louder, the famines are wider, the deception is industrialized. The technology that the book of Revelation needed in order to make sense was unimaginable 100 years ago and is sitting in your pocket right now. And the church that should be sounding the trumpet has muted itself to avoid offending its donor base. So here are the signs that Christ is returning sooner than you think, written by him in advance, fulfilled in front of you, and ignored by the believers he came to gather. The falling away. Inside the church, a woman who led worship for 15 years posts an Instagram caption announcing she has deconstructed her faith, and within an hour, the comment section is filled with other former believers thanking her for the courage. She used to sing the cross, and now she calls it abuse theology. Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the day of the Lord will not come unless the falling away comes first. And Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 4 that in the last days, some will depart from the faith, devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. This is not the world walking away from a faith it never had. This is the church walking away from a faith it once confessed. How often have you scrolled through a deconstruction story and felt sympathy instead of fear? How often have you watched somebody you used to share a small group with rewrite their entire view of God for the audience that pays them now? How often have you wondered quietly if your own faith would survive a year of suffering? The great falling away is not a future event you are waiting for. It is the algorithm refreshing every time you open your phone. But the Jesus who warned that this would happen is the same Jesus who left an empty tomb open behind the storm, and the empty tomb has not moved. The cross paid for the apostate who comes back, and the resurrection still calls every deconstructed believer home if they will turn around before the door closes. The Spirit is still striving with the deconstructed, and he has not yet released the ones the church gave up on. He who endures to the end will be saved, and the one who started a good work in you is still finishing it tonight. Hold what you have, because he is coming. Israel surrounded. A breaking news banner flashes across every screen at the same time. The nations are aligning against Jerusalem again, and a generation that has never read Zechariah is watching prophecy fulfill itself in real time. Zechariah 12 says God will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling for all the nations around, and that all who burden themselves with her will be cut in pieces. Ezekiel 38 names a coalition from the north that comes down against Israel in the latter years, and the geopolitical map of the world has rearranged itself to match that prophecy with a speed that would have been impossible in any prior century. Israel did not exist as a nation from 70 AD until 1948, and then she came back in a single day, exactly as Isaiah 66 asked. Jeremiah 31 said the Lord would gather his people from the ends of the earth, and the airlifts from Yemen, Ethiopia, and Russia turned that prophecy into airline manifests within living memory. How often have you watched the news from the Middle East and treated it as politics? How often have you missed the prophetic timestamp because the segment was sandwiched between sports highlights? How often has the church you sit in skipped the chapter that names this exact moment in history? How often have you been more emotionally invested in the next election cycle than the next chapter of Zechariah? The nation God said he would gather is gathered, and the nations God said would surround her are surrounding her. But the Jesus who timed Israel's restoration is the same Jesus who promised to return to the Mount of Olives, the same mountain he left from in Acts 1. The cross was God's promise to the world. The resurrection was his receipt, and his feet will touch the same hillside he ascended from when the signs reach their fullness. The Spirit who restored Israel after 2,000 years can restore your faith in his timing this week. Watch the borders, but watch your own heart first. Stay through the next sign, because the technology that the Bible could not even name is the technology you carry in your hand every day, and you do not know how close it has brought you to the prophecy. The mark technology has arrived. A toddler waves her hand under a sensor at the grocery store, and the screen blinks green, and her father pays for the food without ever opening a wallet. Revelation 13 says no one will be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark on the right hand or on the forehead. For 19 centuries, that verse sat in the Bible as a future technological impossibility, and within the last decade, the impossibility became infrastructure. The implant chips, the facial recognition systems, the central bank digital currencies under design, the biometric scanners in airports, the social credit scoring already deployed across 1 billion citizens of one country, and the artificial intelligence that can speak in any voice and forge any face, all of it converging in your generation. Revelation 13 also says, "The second beast will give breath to an image of the first beast so that the image will speak." And you can now watch a digital avatar of any dead person speak to you in any language by the end of this year. The prophets did not have words for any of this, and they wrote it down anyway, because the Spirit who carried them knew the screen you are reading this on would exist. How often have you said yes to convenience without ever asking what convenience was being built to enable? How often has the church you attend warned you about any of this? How often have you assumed the mark of the beast was a future problem when the rails for it are being laid in front of your children right now? How often have you traded a piece of your privacy this week without realizing you were practicing for the choice that is coming? But the Jesus who saw this generation from the cross is the same Jesus who refused the kingdoms of the world when Satan offered them on the mountain, and he still refuses every counterfeit empire today. The cross paid for the believer who will refuse the mark, the resurrection sealed the verdict, and the Spirit will give the strength to say no in the hour the choice arrives. You will not stand in that hour alone if you are standing with him now. Mark the one who marked you first with his blood. Love, growing cold when the son blocks his father's number. A daughter cuts off her sister over a political post. A husband walks out on a wife he stood at an altar with. And the entire culture calls every one of these acts brave. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 3 that in the last days men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Read that list and try to deny it describes your social feed. How often have you sat down to talk with a family member and ended the conversation hating each other more than when you started? How often have you mistaken the right to be furious for the right to be unkind? How often have you watched the affection you used to feel for people quietly disappear into the algorithm of suspicion? This is not just cultural decline. This is the prophecy fulfilling itself in your living room. But the Jesus who saw the coldness coming is the same Jesus who washed the feet of the man about to deny him, the same Jesus who prayed forgiveness over the soldiers driving the nails. The cross paid for every relationship you have ruined. The resurrection released a love into the world that does not run cold, and the Spirit was given so that you could love when the air around you is freezing. Stay through the next two signs, because the second to last one is the most overlooked sign of all, and the most surprising place it is being fulfilled is the country where the gospel was almost outlawed a generation ago. The gospel reached the earth. A village pastor in the highlands of Central Asia opens an app on a phone that costs less than a meal and watches a sermon translated into a dialect that did not have a written language 15 years ago. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that the gospel of the kingdom would be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end would come. For 2,000 years, that verse stood as the long arc. The church was still walking inside. And within the last decade, Bible translations crossed the threshold of every major language family on earth. There are still unreached people groups, but the trend line is steeper than at any point in human history, and missionary organizations are now measuring time to completion in years instead of centuries. How often have you assumed the Great Commission was a slow generational project? How often have you been told the church is dying, when the church is, in fact, finishing the assignment Jesus gave it before he left? How often have you missed the sign that the door is closing because the work is almost done? But the Jesus who gave the commission is the same Jesus who promised to be with us to the end of the age. And the end of the age was always defined by the completion of this very task. The cross opened the message, the resurrection authorized it, and the Spirit is the one carrying it past every wall built to stop it. Your generation may be the last that runs. Lawlessness celebrated as virtue. A school board votes unanimously to keep the new curriculum. A corporation announces its rainbow campaign for the 5th year in a row. A celebrity hands out a humanitarian award to someone who built her career denying every line of Genesis, and the audience stands and claps. Isaiah 5 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." Read that verse and ask whether it could have been written about anyone but us. Paul wrote in Romans 1 that the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth, and then he listed the cultural inversions that mark the hour before judgment. 2 Timothy 3 says they will have a form of godliness while denying its power, which is the same crowd that posts Bible verses on Monday and applauds the inversion on Tuesday. How often have you stayed silent at the meeting because the cost of saying the truth was higher than you wanted to pay? How often have you watched the line move and called yourself moderate for not moving with it? How often have you traded the courage of the prophets for the platform of the polite? How often have you noticed your own conscience getting quieter every year because the air around it kept getting louder? The hour is not normal, and the air is not free of judgment just because the sun came up again. But the Jesus who exposes the lawlessness is the same Jesus who walked toward the cross with his face set like flint, and the cross paid for the believer who will stand when others will not. The resurrection promises that the meek will inherit the earth, that the loud have temporarily ceased, and the Spirit will give a backbone to the silent. Speak while you can still speak, because he is coming. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is breaking inside the deconstruction story your friend posted yesterday. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is flashing across the map of the Middle East tonight. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is hiding inside the convenience you tapped into this morning. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is freezing, the affection inside the family group chat you keep muting. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is being translated into a tribal language right now by a missionary you will never meet. Another sign written before you scrolled past it is being applauded at an awards ceremony you will hear about by Monday. The early church watched for these signs with lanterns, and we watch our feeds and miss them. The early church gathered when the signs converged, and we scattered. When the signs accelerated, the early church told everyone the king is coming, and we whisper it during the offering and call it bold. The early church prayed Maranatha at every meal, and we no longer pray for his return at all. The cross set the calendar, the resurrection started the countdown, and the Spirit is the one whispering, "Wake up." Comment below which sign you can already see in your own city, and subscribe so the next warning finds you while the door is still open.